What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through force multipliers and why I am redesigning how I operate and how that is going to help into the future. Also how I'm thinking about this and also possible, bottlenecks that I'm solving for as well. So this is going to be a super fun one and I'm super excited to dive deep into it. So like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models and frameworks, how I'm solving for things, and also just to solve what hurts, basically to come into businesses and organizations and be the chief problem solvers and ultimately just build back-end infrastructure while doing it. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people aligned with the mission of what it is that we're actively striving for, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So this one's going to be super fun one, and it's something that I have been thinking about quite recently and just have been, just running at full tilt and just thinking that, hey, how can I actively just implement force multipliers so that I'm not just, hitting just running at full tilt, if you say, to say, hey, how am I actively just gonna, use what I have as leverage in the sense to build those force multipliers? Because, lately I've been just thinking about how I can implement different force multipliers and not just, focusing on the effort, but basically on the outcome. How can I basically 10x the outcome for what it is that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis in every single aspect, whether it's getting projects done, systems, people, and the structure that makes every move go further than it should. I think this is gonna, ultimately, change the game for me, because one of the things is, as much as, I'm still in that like trenches phase and just building, I think it's not optimal long term, and I want to fix or solve for it before before the machine breaks. And because here's the truth, I've been running at the machine at full tilt, and when you do that long enough, it starts to crack, and I don't want it to get to a point where it cracks, or at least I've realized nowadays that, hey, this machine is kind of cracking and I don't want that. So how can I actively solve for that? So that's why I'm now just doubling down specifically on building force multipliers in every single aspect and thinking, how can I actively, create more, 10x the outcome of what it is that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis? Is it pumping out more builds? Is it pumping out more conversations? Or how can I basically just structure every single thing out? Because I don't want to just, continue running the machine like build, because I think you sometimes, get stuck in that phase where you're just building, but the growth also kind of stalls, and I don't want to get to that point. So that's why I'm actively just solving for it, which we're going to dive deep into a little bit and just understand why these constraints are something that is something that I'm solving for at the moment, and also gonna need to 10x into the future. So basically, running the machine before it breaks equals short-term mindset, at least from what I've my personal experience, that running the machine before it breaks is short-term mindset. How can I then extend my time horizons and how I'm thinking through about things and saying, hey, I don't want to be a builder who just waits until things are on fire. I want to be proactive. I just want to make sure that we're proactively just creating solutions and actively just building, because we're building predictive analysis tools inside Killer Chaos OS. So why don't I just just focus that on what it is that I'm doing day to day? Is it managing tasks, just getting things done, and ultimately just building the machine? I think this is ultimately gonna just 10x what we're gonna do into the future. But how can I actively do that? I think force multipliers is something that I need to just double down on in terms of thinking and saying, hey, I want to design for scale before it starts, before fires start. Ultimately saying, hey, I want to be able to predictively understand that, hey, these are the fires that are going to happen in 1 to 2 months or 6 months. So I ultimately just need to solve for that right away before it hits, because right now that's where false multipliers come in, and that's why I'm bringing in an EA, because I think right now one of the most important things is that I'm just building, but a lot of things are just getting lost in translations, whether it's communications or just structuring out a lot of things. I think it could be done a lot more efficiently if I just if I assistantly had like a second half or a second intelligence brain that I can actively just hand off these things to and say, hey, this EA is basically not gonna just run my errands, but is gonna be a tactical extension of my brain, which is also super important. How can I tactically just extend my brain so that we're actively just getting more done and saying, hey, this is a system within a system. How can I actively just have someone there that is ultimately just acting as a force multiplier for what it is that I'm ultimately doing right now? Because saying, hey, this is going to be someone that's going to own 80% of the things that clog the pipes. Ultimately, someone that's going to see things that, I may not be seeing in the present moment in time, because I'm just building and saying, hey, so how can I double down on the 20% that compounds, so 80-20 rules, to ultimately say, hey, how can I focus on the highest leverage things of that 20%, so that we can ultimately just, keep pumping the machine? Because I don't want to, get stuck in that builder's mindset of just pumping, and also just, just perfecting and getting these videos to a standard that, ultimately just provides value. I think, this is ultimately going to help that, and it's going to feed into a bunch of different things, because hey, if I'm now running the machine and getting, excellent help in different facets, I know that is only just going to be a force multiplier and going to 10x what it is that I'm doing, which is going to be super tactical in the long run. At least the way that I see it right now, that hey, this is a constraint, and like I said in the past few videos, that you only move as fast as you're constrained. So ultimately, just solving this ultimately allows us to move more faster and build more things, and this is going to play vital, which I'm also just going to make sure that we're tracking, like implementing KPIs, making sure that this is actively, creating an ROI into the long run, which is also super important. And that's why structure is a weapon and not a limitation. Saying, hey, the old version of me thought that structure slowed me down. Ultimately saying, hey, in as much as we can have like specific structures and, just how we handle docs and things like that, we need to just be more tactical in that, and ultimately solving that. I know that, but I know that structure is speed if you build it right. Ultimately, just moving as fast as your slowest constraint, and understanding that, hey, we need to ultimately just solve for this, and I know that I need to solve for this, and how can I actively solve for this? Just building more structure. And I think just extending that, or having a extension of me and the second brain, I think that is ultimately going to be able to solve for that. But basically, ultimately, this is going to come down to how redefining how I operate. So basically, daily systems, clean handoffs, guardrails around my time, which is also super important to basically schedule out, calls, and just help me prepare for those specific calls that need to be prepared for. And also just making sure that I can, just have that deep focus on things that I want to focus on, or that I have to focus on that specific day. Because I think, one of the most important things, at least from my experience, is that I need to make sure that I'm just focusing my time solely on the highest leverage things that are ultimately gonna yield us an ROI into the future. And how can I actively do that? Ultimately, just understanding that, hey, these are the constraints that we're having in this current present moment in time, and this is why I'm actively needing to build these force multipliers. Because in as much as you can just run and just run the machine at full tilt, ultimately I think what's going to change the paradigm, or at least change the game, is going to be those force multipliers. And by having those force multipliers, whether it's guardrailing my time, more efficiency and structure, and building those clean handoffs, I know that into the future it's just only going to compound. And how can I build those compounding steps? I think right now it's solely just thinking about how we're going to actively just build these force multipliers, because these force multipliers are going to be somewhat of a system within a system that is ultimately just going to allow us to just build a machine in the way that we need to, and into the future. And like this, also just want to just share something that I've been doing recently. I'm not using guesswork for this, but basically I've been watching Harvard Business School breakdowns every single day. And I think this is something that is ultimately just refining the brain, because for me, I think just ultimately just learning and being a lifelong learner is also ultimately something that is a false multiplier, and it compounds over a long time horizon. To say, hey, in as much as we're learning, we're building stuff, we have projects, in terms of what I'm doing on the back end in my personal life, I'm just ultimately just keeping on learning, and that learning never should stop, because always staying ahead of the curve is something that I ultimately am super bullish on, and know that is going to be a force multiplier into the future. But it's ultimately going to compound each and every single day. Let's say, hey, we read for an hour each and every single day. In the year, you're not going to be the same person that you were in the beginning of the year. So ultimately asking how can I actively just use those like small needle movers to ultimately stay ahead of the curve and constantly just learn, because you get lots of new nuggets as well. And certain things I've even gotten from these Harvard Business School breakdowns that I've actively just implemented and just shared in these videos as well, which has ultimately helped a lot. And also just making sure that I'm a better builder, a better operator, and a better leader for the team as well. Which is ultimately just going to say, hey, I need to just focus, just hit the nail in the wall each and every single day and create these force multipliers that are going to only just 10x into the future. But in order to do that, I believe that it needs to start with those small compounding daily actions that are going to snowball into the future. So I'm super patient on that and making sure that, hey, each and every single day, we're just adding these small little things that are going to, build us into the future, even though it may not seem like it's paying off in the time, in the present moment in time. Ultimately, I know that into the future, this is the way that we're going to be able to reshape industries and also just build Killer Chaos OS into the internal operating systems internal operating system that's going to fuel businesses, and saying, hey, this is how executives delegate, how operators think, and how organizations scale without diluting output. Ultimately just asking how can I actively just 10x what we're doing, and making sure that in every facet we're constantly just using force multipliers as our unfair advantage. But this also just comes at something that I have also just been implementing, which is through conversations and saying, hey, it's not just systems or hires, it's how I show up in dialogue too, saying, hey, on X, in DMs, in calls, every word, question, and insight is now part of a larger feedback loop. And I think just building those feedback loops ultimately is going to be what's going to help us, to understand the pain points and also just build new things that we wouldn't have thought to be true at that present moment in time. But through those feedback loops and those conversations, we found to be true. And I think that, conversations as well is going to be a key thing in terms of building those force multipliers, because those force multipliers through conversations are going to empower us to then understand, hey, these are the common themes or the common pain points that people are facing on a day-to-day basis. So now that we understand that and we know that they're leading their respective industry, we know that at the forefront these are the problems that they're facing. So trickling down, we know that everyone, or most likely everyone below that or kind of below that, is ultimately going to be facing this somewhat of a similar problem. They're just facing it at a smaller scale, and then when they scale up, they're going to be facing it. So which is also going to be super important just to think about and saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're using conversations as our force multipliers to understand how we're building and also where we're falling short, because I know that building those data points and those feedback loops is only just gonna help us refine Killer Chaos OS into this into this ops intelligence brain and self-healing infrastructure that I see the big picture vision being for the future, and saying, hey, I'm designing conversations to become data. How can we actively use these conversations to become data points so that we can ultimately just build better machines and ultimately scale these machines inside businesses? And saying, hey, I'm turning intel into insights and insights into the product, ultimately just focusing solely on building the product. How can we actively use these insights to build the product in the way that we need to build it, and also making sure that we're building it right? Because I know that into the future, all of these small little things are gonna just refine how we're thinking about things. And like I said, with these videos, they're just 100 videos, 100 insights equals one refined machine and one refined self, which I am super bullish on nowadays, to say, hey, we're building all these insights. Some of the things we may be completely wrong, but ultimately, how can we transform into that version that we can ultimately just build this big picture vision for Killer Chaos OS, and ultimately just build backend infrastructure that scales internal operations, which I am super excited about, and also making sure that each and every single day we are just pushing the needle forward each and every single day, so that we understand what it is that we need to be building, and having that dialogue as well is going to be super important. So just doubling down simply on those conversations, I believe, is going to be a massive ROI into the future, especially when it comes to force multipliers. And this is how even dialogue can be architected, in my personal belief, and saying, hey, it's all part of the force multiplier effect. So basically the question that I'm basically asking around this, if you want to know, is basically how can I create these mini force multipliers that can compound over an extended period of time? So it doesn't have to be today, it doesn't have to be tomorrow, but in the next few months to a year, how can can these small, daily actions or these things that we're doing, how can they act as force multipliers to 10x our outcome in terms of our throughput and what we are doing on a day-to-day basis? Because right now, like most of the time, or at least now, the most important thing that I've been super bullish on lately is just compounding, the compounding effect, and how things just compound and snowball, and just making sure that, hey, if we want to make sure we want to get to where we want to get to, we need to make sure the compounding steps are ultimately building that big picture vision. But also, the real reason simply for all of this is to buy back my time for deep work. I think one of the most important things that I am super, why I got into just building, I think for myself and my personal self, I'm just a natural builder. I want to build stuff and I just want to make things that people use into the future. And this ultimately is something that I'm super bullish on, to say, hey, how can I actively just turn this idea into physical, tangible form? I think that has ultimately always been my insight. When I was younger, I used to just literally just go outside and just build these mini bridges over like mud and stuff like that, and ultimately just having that mindset of, hey, I just want to be doing more. I just want to be building, and I just want to be making sure that, hey, I'm getting stuff done and I'm creating as much value as I possibly can. And this is why the EA, the structure, the conversations, all of this isn't just about doing more, it's about building the room. Ultimately saying, hey, how can I actively just focus on doing more deep work that ultimately allows me to, just find more joy, because I wouldn't have gotten into this if I just did not enjoy building. And I think building is one of the most important things that I want to just, dial in on, and just be, super dialed in on, and making sure that, hey, I have the room, I'm building this room to think deeply, I'm building this room to execute Killer Chaos OS without constraints, and I will also building the room for the future, which is one of the most important things, where we're going to be hopefully redefining industries, building insane amounts of value, impact, and also just inspiring millions of people, which will be a super cool future. Imagine us Killer Chaos OS just inspiring the future, or just inspiring millions of people to also lead the next frontier. I think that would be, one of the most exciting futures to wake up to, and, just build. I'm just super excited and I'm super pumped to be building this. And that's because that's where I create leverage, ultimately saying, hey, where are the leverage points that I'm actively focusing on, and how can I simply just dial in that more? Because where I create the most amount of leverage, I think that's where we can ultimately 10x throughput and output. And saying, hey, where is this all going? Basically, EA is onboarding this month. Basically, scratch that. I kind of, just onboarded yesterday. So we've basically got a new EA. I've sold for that pretty quick. So ops, scheduling follow-ups, and strategic preps. So I've actively just solved for that a lot quicker than I had expected, because I just want to just move a lot quicker than our slowest constraints. And also just designing a machine making hierarchy. So this is the Dan Martel method that I read from Buy Back Your Time. Shout out to Dan Martel. Well, you basically come in with 3 problems, or you come in with one problem and then 3 possible solutions, and then the person that is reporting those problems comes up with one idea or one solution that they think is right, and then ultimately you just take that. So that's also something that I'm looking to implement, and saying, hey, so less hits my desk, so that we're not just building all these different things, or things piling on my desk, and we just have to solve things and just come so many things. I think focus and strategic focus is going to play such a key role, and saying, hey, creating a conversational CRM for X chats. So ultimately just getting the chats that we're having, which then turn into insights, which then turns into the roadmap, and saying, hey, 90-day force multiplier plan, structure, subtract, scale. How can we structure things differently? How can we subtract things that we're doing at the moment? And how can we actively use those things to ultimately scale, which is going to be something that we're going to be super dialed in on, which I'm sure that, hey, we're going to fail so many times, but I think the most important thing is that we just keep hitting the nail in the wall, and we just keep testing and trying things and just iterating. And I think iteration is the key to innovation, and through that we're just going to use that to force multiply in every single aspect, and saying, hey, force isn't just about effort, it's about focus multiplied by systems, and saying, hey, this is if this is how we're basically going to be doing things. And if I'm going to build a $100 million backend engine, I need to build my own backend with the same intensity. Simply just saying, hey, if we're going to have this $100 million worth of impact into the future, how can I expect to do that if I don't build my backend with the same intensity? I think the best thing to do is ultimately just build my backend with the same intensity and the same mindset and throughput, and then we'll ultimately get there. But through that, we just need to take those small daily actions each and every single day so that we can actively just build the future and understand how to build Killer Chaos OS into this massive beast that we're looking to, and building those force multipliers, which I know is going to build massive ROI into the future. And through these force multipliers, I think they're going to redefine how I operate and how I think and how I am actively solving into the future. Just more force multipliers that I can basically compound within my daily lives, because it's the small small actions that you take on a daily basis, and I think are just going to completely change the game. So I'm super excited to continue building Killer Chaos OS, implementing these force multipliers, and also redefining how I operate. And I think in the future I'm going to make a follow-up video to basically break this down of how it's going and how I am actively thinking about this, because into the future I want to just make sure that we're actively just doing things that we need to do on a day-to-day basis and create this force multiplier effect. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.